You ever have that one neighbor who thinks the entire neighborhood revolves around them? The kind of person who always finds something to complain about, who acts like they're the guardian of the block, when in reality they're just a pain to everyone around them? Well, that's exactly the kind of neighbor I had. And let me tell you, when he decided to call code enforcement on me, he made the single biggest mistake of his life. Because little did he know, I wasn't just another homeowner trying to keep up with the rules. I was one of the people who actually wrote the building code for our city. It all started the day I decided to do a small project on my property. Nothing fancy, nothing extreme, just something to improve the look and function of my house. I had planned it for weeks, pulled every single permit, filed every document, and made sure I followed every little regulation down to the last line. Why? Because that's literally my job. I'm a professional who spent years drafting, reviewing, and revising the very rules that govern construction in our area. So when I start a project, you better believe it's going to be by the book. But, of course, my neighbor, let's call him Frank, had a different opinion. Frank is the kind of guy who thinks every hammer sound is an assault on his peace, every parked truck is a violation of his imaginary property lines, and every change in the neighborhood is a direct threat to his authority. He struts around like the sheriff of the block, pointing out violations that don't exist and complaining to anyone who will listen. The truth is, he thrives on drama. And unfortunately for him, I was about to give him more than he could handle. On the very first day of my project, Frank came storming out of his house, arms crossed, a scowl plastered across his face. He didn't even say hello. He just pointed at the workers unloading equipment and barked, "You can't do that here, that's against code." I raised an eyebrow and calmly explained that everything was permitted, approved, and completely legal. But Frank didn't want to hear it. He puffed up his chest and said, "I know the rules. I've lived here longer than you. This whole setup is illegal, and I'm not going to stand for it." I could have laughed right there, but I didn't. Instead, I let him keep talking, because sometimes it's better to let entitled people dig their own grave. He ranted about noise, about property values, about how the neighborhood was going downhill because of people like me. Then, with a smug little grin, he announced, "I'm calling code enforcement." Now, most people would panic at those words. Nobody wants to deal with inspectors showing up at their door, questioning every little thing, digging for mistakes. But me? I almost wanted to thank him. Because what Frank didn't realize was that calling code enforcement on me was like challenging a chess grandmaster to a game of checkers. He thought he was going to win easily, but the match was already over before it began. Sure enough, a few days later, a code enforcement officer came by. Frank was practically bouncing with excitement, standing on his porch with his arms folded, waiting to watch me get busted. The officer walked over, clipboard in hand, and introduced himself. I smiled, welcomed him onto the property, and handed him a neatly organized folder containing every single permit, document, and inspection approval already signed off by the city. The officer flipped through the pages, nodded, and said, "Looks good to me." You should have seen Frank's face. It was like someone popped his balloon. His smug grin melted into disbelief and then into pure frustration. He started sputtering. But he can't do this! It's against the rules!" The officer gave him a polite but firm look and said, "Actually, sir, everything here is perfectly legal. In fact, this project is one of the cleanest I've seen in a while." Frank wasn't ready to give up, though. He kept pressing, pointing at random things and shouting, "What about that? Isn't that too close to the fence? Isn't that wall too high?" The officer calmly explained that every single measurement was within the allowed limits. I stood there silently, letting Frank embarrass himself, because sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. The officer asked me a couple of clarifying questions about the design, and I answered with detailed knowledge, citing specific code numbers and regulations. The officer raised an eyebrow, surprised, and asked, "You seem to know the building code very well." I smiled and said, "Well, I should. I helped write it." The look on Frank's face at that moment was priceless. His jaw actually dropped. He went from arrogant to shocked to furious in a matter of seconds. He had no idea that the person he tried to sabotage was one of the people who literally shaped the rules. It was like trying to report a teacher to the principal for breaking classroom rules, only to find out the teacher wrote the entire school policy. The officer laughed, shook my hand, and said, "Well then, I think we're done here. Keep up the good work." With that, he walked off the property, leaving Frank standing there red-faced and humiliated. But here's the thing. People like Frank don't give up easily. Humiliation doesn't teach them humility, it only fuels their entitlement. And while I had won that battle, I knew he wasn't finished with me yet. He would try again in some new way because people like him can't stand to be proven wrong. They can't accept that the world doesn't bend to their ego, and I was right, because what happened next took his entitlement to a whole new level. After that first visit from code enforcement, most reasonable people would have backed down, maybe even felt a little embarrassed, and moved on with their lives. But not Frank. No, Frank was different. The man couldn't stand the idea of losing. He couldn't stand the fact that he had been shown up in front of an official and, even worse, by the neighbor he'd been trying to control. Instead of learning his lesson, he doubled down. Over the next few days, I started noticing little things. Frank would stand outside on his porch, pretending to water his plants, but his eyes were glued to my property. He'd pull out his phone and start taking pictures of every small thing: workers carrying tools, trucks parked in front of my house, even piles of materials that were waiting to be installed. He thought he was gathering evidence, like some detective on a mission. In reality, he was just showing how desperate he'd become. Then came the complaints. Not to code enforcement this time. He started calling the homeowners association. He wrote long, angry emails about how my project was ruining the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. He claimed it was driving down property values, scaring off potential buyers, and disrupting the peace of the community. He even tried to rally a few of the other neighbors, telling them I was breaking rules left and right. Here's the thing, though. Most of my neighbors actually liked me. They knew I was responsible, they knew I kept my property in good shape, and they knew Frank was, well, Frank. So when he came knocking on their doors trying to stir up trouble, most of them politely brushed him off. Some even warned me about his antics, rolling their eyes and saying, "That guy just doesn't quit, does he?" The HOA finally sent someone out to investigate his complaints, but just like code enforcement, they found absolutely nothing wrong. My permits were perfect. My property was spotless, and every rule was being followed to the letter. Once again, Frank had nothing. Once again, he had embarrassed himself. You'd think that would stop him, but no. This man was determined to make my life miserable. He started nitpicking the smallest things. If one of my workers parked their truck, with a tire slightly on the curb, Frank would come storming out, phone in hand, threatening to call the tow company. If construction noise lasted 1 minute past the allowed time, Frank would scream from across the street, "I'm reporting this!" He even complained when a delivery truck accidentally blocked his driveway for less than 30 seconds. At first, I tried to ignore him. I figured he would get bored eventually, that he'd find someone else to bother. But the more I ignored him, the more aggressive he became. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to break down, to snap, to lose my cool so he could feel like he'd won. And trust me, there were moments when I almost did. There were times I had to take a deep breath and remind myself that the best revenge was patience. But the real turning point came one afternoon when I caught him on my property. Yes, you heard that right. Frank actually crossed the line, literally. I walked out to check on the project, and there he was, standing inside my yard, phone out, taking close-up pictures of the foundation work. I asked him what the hell he was doing, and he had the audacity to say, "I have a right to make sure this is legal." I couldn't help but laugh. "You don't have any right to step foot on my property. I told him. "Now get out before I call the police." He smirked like he thought I was bluffing, but I pulled out my phone and started dialing. That wiped the grin right off his face. He muttered something under his breath and stormed off, slamming his gate so hard it echoed down the street. That was when I realized this wasn't just about noise or construction. This was about control. Frank couldn't stand the fact that he didn't have power over me. He had spent years bullying neighbors into doing what he wanted, and I was the first person who not only refused to bow down but also outsmarted him at every turn. That drove him insane, and so he escalated again. A week later, another code enforcement officer showed up. This time, Frank had filed a formal complaint, claiming I was building something outside the scope of my permit. He pointed at the new structure and insisted it was taller than regulations allowed. The officer came, measured everything, checked my papers, and once again confirmed that everything was perfectly legal. Frank was furious. He started yelling at the officer, demanding that they do their job and stop looking the other way. The officer, to his credit, stayed calm and professional, but I could tell he was getting irritated with Frank's attitude. After the inspection, he pulled me aside and said, "Don't worry, we know what's going on here. You're fine. But if he keeps filing false complaints, there may be consequences for him." That was music to my ears. For the first time, I saw the tables beginning to turn. Frank wasn't just making a fool of himself anymore. He was starting to cross into harassment territory, and the authorities were noticing. But the best part? Frank still didn't realize just how deep of a hole he was digging. Because while he was busy trying to sabotage me, I was quietly documenting everything. Every false report, every trespass, every outburst. I had it all on record. I didn't plan to use it yet, but I knew the day would come when it would all come in handy, and oh, that day was closer than even I realized, because the next stunt Frank pulled, that was the one that finally pushed me to put my plan into action, the one that turned his obsession into his downfall. And let me tell you, when it all came crashing down on him, it was more satisfying than I could have ever imagined. The day Frank finally overplayed his hand started off like any other. My workers were making steady progress, deliveries came in on schedule, and everything was running smoothly. But then, right before lunch, I heard raised voices outside. When I stepped out, there he was, Frank, red-faced, screaming at the delivery driver who had just dropped off materials. He claimed the truck had blocked the street, though in reality there was plenty of space for cars to pass. But this time, Frank didn't stop at yelling. He actually pulled out his phone, started recording, and threatened the driver, saying he was going to make sure this whole project was shut down. He shouted loud enough for the entire street to hear. The driver looked shaken. My workers stood frozen, and I realized right then, this was the moment I'd been waiting for. I walked over calmly, phone in hand, and began recording him. "Frank," I said, loud and clear, "this is harassment. You've trespassed on my property, filed false complaints, and now you're threatening people. It stops today." He sneered at me, but I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He tried to regain control, barking at me, "You don't know the law. You don't even know what you're doing here." That was when I couldn't resist. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "Frank, I wrote the building code." The silence that followed was golden. He blinked, stunned, like the air had just been knocked out of him. For the first time, he realized that all this time, he hadn't just been fighting a neighbor. He had been fighting the person who literally helped write the very rules he was trying to use against me. And now, the whole street knew it too. I could see the neighbors peeking through windows, some even standing outside watching the scene unfold. The delivery driver smirked, realizing the bully had just been exposed. Frank tried to stammer a reply, but nothing came out. For once, the man who always had something to say was completely speechless. But I wasn't done yet. Over the next few days, I put my plan into motion. Remember all those recordings, complaints, and documents I'd been keeping? I sent them to the proper authorities. Not just code enforcement, but the city as well. Every false claim he had made, every baseless report, every time he had crossed the line, it was all laid out neatly in black and white. And guess what? They took it seriously. A week later, Frank received an official notice. He was being fined for filing multiple false reports and warned that any further harassment could result in legal action. On top of that, the HOA, tired of his endless emails and rants, issued him a formal reprimand. His reputation in the neighborhood, once feared, was now shattered. People had seen his true colors, and they weren't impressed. Meanwhile, my project went on without a hitch. The structure was completed on time, every inspection passed with flying colors, and I received compliments from the very neighbors Frank had tried to turn against me. Some even joked, well, at least Frank gave us some entertainment. But the real cherry on top? Seeing Frank avoid eye contact every time I stepped outside. The man who used to puff out his chest, ready to bark orders, now kept his head down. He didn't shout anymore. He didn't call code enforcement. He didn't send emails. He had been defeated, not with anger, not with shouting matches, but with patience, knowledge, and a little bit of strategy. And deep down, I knew he would never forget that line. I wrote the building code. It was the truth, and it was the one thing he could never argue against. Every time he looked at my property, every time he saw the finished project standing strong, he was reminded that he had picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. For me, it wasn't just about winning against Frank. It was about standing up to bullies. People like him thrive on fear and intimidation, and they expect everyone to roll over. But when you stay calm, when you know your rights, and when you refuse to be pushed around, you take away their power. And that's the lesson I'll leave you with. If you ever find yourself dealing with a Frank in your life, someone who thinks they can control you with threats and lies, don't let them. Stand your ground, be smart, document everything, and remember that knowledge is the greatest weapon you can have. Because when the truth is on your side, no amount of yelling or scheming can defeat you. In the end, Frank became his own downfall. His obsession with controlling everyone else blinded him to the reality that he had no control at all. And while he wasted his time trying to tear me down, I built something lasting, something solid, both on my property and in my peace of mind. So the next time you hear someone brag about calling code enforcement, just smile. Because for all their bluster, they may not realize who they're really dealing with. And as for Frank, let's just say he learned the hard way. Never pick a fight with the guy who wrote the building code.